As the last wisps of daylight fled the stained streets, the neon sigils of Joe's Tavern flickered to life, beckoning the damned and the downtrodden to come and worship at the altar of desperation. Beyond the grimy windows, a tide of humanity ebbed and flowed, each face a topography of broken dreams and forsaken hopes. Inside, the air reeked of stale beer and exhausted possibilities, the shadows cast by the flickering lights like grasping fingers of the damned. Joe, the proprietor, stood sentinel behind the bar, his eyes sunken, his smile a rictus grin carved into a face worn smooth by the relentless tides of time. He polished a mug with a dirty rag, his gaze roving over the assortment of misfits gathered at the bar, each one a testament to the crushing weight of the outside world. To the left, a woman with hair the color of burnt orange and eyes like two holes punched in the fabric of reality nursed a drink, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the veil of reality. Next to her, a man with arms like gnarled tree branches and a face that seemed to have been put together from spare parts hunched over a shot glass, his eyes red-rimmed from a lifetime of hard miles and harder choices. At the end of the bar, a figure shrouded in shadows sipped a drink that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly glow, the silence emanating from it like a palpable force field, repelling the advances of the desperate and the damned. The only sound, the soft hum of the neon signs, a maddening drone that seemed to synchronize the heartbeats of the damned, drawing them closer, ever closer, to the abyss that waited patiently beyond the doors of Joe's Tavern. As the door creaked open, admitting a gust of soggy night air and a figure that seemed to unravel from the very darkness itself. The newcomer's eyes, two black holes that sucked in the feeble light, scoured the room with a gaze that stripped the patrons of their pretenses, their secrets, their very souls. The air seemed to thicken, the shadows congealing around the figure like a living, breathing entity. Joe, ever the accommodating host, slid a shot glass down the bar with a practiced flourish, the liquid within glowing with an ethereal blue light that seemed to seep into the pores of the patrons, drawing them in with its siren's call. The newcomer's fingers, long and spindly as a corpse's, wrapped around the glass, the gesture economical, precise, and slightly off. At the opposite end of the bar, the burnt orange-haired woman's gaze flickered, her eyes flashing with a momentary spark of recognition before resuming their thousand-yard stare. The gnarled, branch-like man beside her shifted, his face creaking into a grimace that might have been a smile, or a snarl, or something altogether more sinister. The figure shrouded in shadows at the end of the bar remained immobile, the only visible movement the soft, hypnotic glow of the drink, now swirling with an intensity that threatened to consume the entire room. The hum of the neon signs grew louder, a cadence of damnation that synchronized the heartbeats of the patrons, drawing them closer, ever closer, to the abyss. As the newcomer's fingers closed around the shot glass, the shadows seemed to deepen, the air thickening with an unspoken promise of revelations to come, of secrets to be unearthed, of horrors to be unleashed upon an unsuspecting world. And in the midst of this gathering storm, Joe's Tavern stood as a beacon, a way station on the road to perdition, where the damned and the doomed gathered to pay their last, lingering tributes to the darkness that lurked, waiting, just beyond the edge of town. Beyond the edge of town, where the streetlights faltered, and the darkness pooled like a morass, waiting to consume the unwary. It was said that on certain nights, when the moon hung low in the sky, you could hear the whispers of the forgotten, their pleas for salvation echoing through the deserted alleys, their whispers riding the wind like a mournful sigh. Inside Joe's Tavern, the shadows deepened, the air growing heavier with the weight of unspoken truths. The newcomer's eyes, two voids that seemed to drink in the light, locked onto the shrouded figure at the end of the bar, and for an instant, the room held its breath, the patrons frozen in anticipation of the horrors to come. The glass, still clutched in the newcomer's bony fingers, seemed to glow with an otherworldly intensity, as if the very essence of the abyss had been distilled within. The burnt orange-haired woman's gaze flickered once, twice, and then locked onto the newcomer, her eyes burning with a hunger that seemed to defy the boundaries of mortal comprehension. The gnarled, branch-like man beside her reached out a hand, his fingers closing around her wrist with a grip that seemed both tender and unyielding. His eyes, two glacial orbs, locked onto the newcomer, and for an instant, the room seemed to hold its breath, the shadows coalescing into a living, breathing entity that watched, waited, and hungered. Joe, the proprietor, polished a mug with a dirty rag, his eyes glinting with a knowledge that seemed to transcend mortal understanding. He knew the secrets, the whispers, the horrors that lurked beyond the edge of town. He knew the price of admission, the toll that had to be paid to indulge in the forbidden knowledge that flowed like a black, viscous tide through Joe's tavern. And as the newcomer's fingers tightened around the glass, the room seemed to unravel, the shadows bursting forth like a dark, living tide, as the patrons of Joe's tavern were drawn, inexorably, into the abyss. Into the abyss, their faces twisted into rictus grins, their eyes rolling back in their sockets like slot machines spinning out of control. The air was heavy with the stench of ozone and corruption, the neon signs above the bar pulsing with a frenzied energy that seemed to drive the patrons further, ever further, into the heart of madness. The shrouded figure at the end of the bar remained immobile, a dark, statuesque presence that seemed to siphon the light out of the room, leaving only an abyssal void that threatened to consume all in its path. The glass, still clutched in the newcomer's fingers, pulsed with an eldritch power, as if the very essence of the abyss had been distilled within. The burnt orange-haired woman's gaze had transformed into a burning intensity, her pupils dilated to black holes that seemed to suck in the light, her mouth working in a silent, ecstatic chant. The gnarled, branch-like man beside her had become a twisted, arthritic sculpture, his fingers wrapping around her wrist like roots digging deep into the earth. Joe, the proprietor, stood at the center of the maelstrom, his eyes glinting with an otherworldly knowledge, his smile a grotesque parody of hospitality. He seemed to be orchestrating the chaos, his hands weaving intricate patterns in the air as if conducting a dark, infernal symphony. And at the heart of the madness, the newcomer stood, a cipher for the abyss itself, the glass still clutched in their fingers like a chalice overflowing with horrors beyond mortal comprehension. The room had become a vortex, a whirlpool of despair that threatened to drag all in its path down into the darkest depths of the underworld. As the patrons of Joe's tavern succumbed to the abyss, their screams became a chorus of damnation, echoing through the deserted streets, beckoning in the darkness that lurked beyond the edge of town, drawing it closer, ever closer, to the threshold of Joe's tavern, where the damned and the doomed gathered to pay their last, lingering tributes to the horrors that lurked in the shadows, waiting to claim them, to drag them screaming into the abyss, to make them part of the eternal, damnation-fueled chorus that echoed through the desolate alleys of the town. The neon signs, now blazing with an otherworldly intensity, seemed to dissolve into a kaleidoscope of colors, a mad whirlwind of light and sound that threatened to consume all in its path. The shadows, now sentient, living entities, slithered across the walls, tendrils of darkness that probed, explored, and devoured. The air was heavy with the stench of brimstone and decay, the very fabric of reality seeming to unravel like a tapestry ravaged by time and corruption. In the midst of the maelstrom, the newcomer stood, a monolithic figure, their eyes blazing with an eldritch power, their fingers still clenched around the glass, now a vessel for the horrors that lurked beyond the veil of reality. The glass, a portal to the abyss, pulsed with an otherworldly energy, a siren's call to the damned and the doomed, beckoning them closer, ever closer, to the threshold of madness. As the patrons of Joe's tavern succumbed to the abyss, their bodies began to contort, twist, and mutate, their faces elongating into grotesque parodies of humanity, their screams dissolving into a cacophony of terror that echoed through the deserted streets. The shadows coalesced into twisted, nightmarish forms, hieroglyphs of horror that seemed to writhe, twist, and pulse with a life of their own. And at the center of the vortex, Joe, the proprietor, stood, his eyes aglow with an unnatural light, his smile a twisted, demoniacal grimace, as he orchestrated the chaos, conducting the symphony of damnation with an otherworldly flair. With an otherworldly flair, his hands weaving intricate patterns in the air, as if guiding the darkness itself. The shadows responded, swirling around him in a maddening dance, their tendrils curling around the patrons like cold, dead fingers. The burnt orange-haired woman, now a twisted, elongated thing, her eyes bulging from their sockets, her mouth open in a scream that was both silent and deafening, her body contorting into impossible shapes as if trying to escape the abyss that had claimed her. The gnarled, branch-like man, his face a twisted mask of terror, his eyes rolled back in his head, his mouth working in a silent, animalistic scream, his body writhing like a serpent as the shadows wrapped around him, pulling him down, down, down into the depths of the abyss. The air was thick with the stench of corruption, the very fabric of reality seeming to unravel as the darkness poured in, a black, viscous tide that threatened to consume all in its path. The neon signs, now blazing with an otherworldly intensity, seemed to pulse in time with the patrons' screams, their colors bleeding into a mad, kaleidoscopic whirlwind of terror. As the darkness reached its climax, the newcomer's eyes, two blazing stars of madness, locked onto Joe, the proprietor, and for an instant, the room seemed to freeze, the shadows holding their breath, the patrons' screams dying on their lips. In that moment, the abyss yawned open, a chasm of madness that seemed to stretch from the depths of the underworld to the very gates of eternity. And the patrons of Joe's Tavern, now mere puppets of the darkness, were drawn, inexorably, into its gaping maw,